He walked out on Christmas morning and returned 30 years later with the truth. That's how my story begins, my dear. Not with carols or laughter, not with the smell of cinnamon and pine, but with the soft click of a door closing behind the man I thought would never leave. I still remember the light that day, the kind of golden winter sun that makes the frost sparkle on the window panes. Our little house smelled of gingerbread and coffee. The tree stood by the window, half hidden under the paper snowflakes our son Matthew had made. I was humming while setting the table. 2 plates, 2 cups, and a small red candle in the center. Henry came down the stairs quietly, already dressed in his old brown coat. He didn't smell of cologne that morning, only of cold air and distance. Going somewhere? I asked, trying to sound playful. Breakfast's ready. He looked at me then, and there was something in his eyes I had never seen before, a kind of hollow gentleness. I just need a bit of air, he said. Won't be long, I laughed. On Christmas morning? But he didn't answer. He just kissed my forehead, picked up the worn leather bag from the floor, and stepped out into the quiet snow. The door shut softly. That was it. No fight, no explanation, no goodbye, just silence. At first, I told myself he'd gone to fetch something for Matthew, maybe the toy train he'd hidden, or perhaps a surprise gift. I kept the breakfast warm, humming to fill the spaces between my heartbeat. An hour passed, then 2, then the coffee grew cold, and the candle melted down to nothing. By afternoon, the neighbors came by with casseroles and cheer. Where's Henry? They asked. Oh, he just stepped out, I said. Even then, I didn't believe he was gone. That night, I tucked Matthew into bed. He was only 8, his eyes full of confusion. Did Daddy forget the presents? He whispered. No, sweetheart, I said. He'll be back soon. He just had something to take care of. But as I turned off the light, I saw the empty chair by the window, the one Henry always sat in to play his guitar. The silence around it was louder than any storm. Days became weeks. The police took a statement. The neighbors whispered. Letters went unanswered. And somewhere between the questions and the waiting, I learned how a heart can keep beating even when it's broken. People think grief comes when someone dies, but grief also lives in absence, in the long stretches of maybe. Maybe he'll call, maybe he'll walk through the door, maybe there's a reason. I told myself 1,000 stories to survive the waiting. He'd lost his memory. He'd been in an accident. He was ashamed, sick, scared, anything but cruel, because cruelty was something Henry was not. At least, not the man I knew. That first Christmas without him felt like the world had forgotten color. I put away his coat, folded his shirts, and hid the mug he always used. Not to forget, but to stop bleeding. When Matthew asked again, I told him the truth a mother tells to protect her child. Your father had to go away for a while, darling, but he loves you very much. He nodded solemnly, holding his little toy train. And I remember thinking, children believe in return long after adults have given up. Years rolled forward like slow snowdrifts. Matthew grew, strong and kind, the way his father had been in the early days. He stopped asking where Henry was when he turned 12, but every Christmas he'd place 2 stockings on the mantel, one for me, one for his father. I never had the heart to stop him. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, I'd hear footsteps in my dreams, the sound of boots on snow, a knock at the door, a voice whispering my name, and I'd wake up reaching for a ghost that never came. 30 years is a long time to live with questions. People told me to move on, but how do you move on when love leaves without a reason? When the last words were not a fight, but a promise to come right back? I rebuilt my life in small ways, gardening, teaching piano to neighborhood children, writing letters I never sent. And yet, every Christmas morning, I still laid out 2 plates. One for me, one for the man who walked out and never returned. It was the Christmas of my 65th year when the knock finally came. The snow was falling softly again, the same kind of hush that had filled that first morning of his absence. I opened the door expecting carolers. Instead, there he was. Henry, older, thinner, hair turned to silver. The same coat, worn and faded, still clinging to him like a memory that refused to let go. For a moment, neither of us spoke. 30 years of silence hung between us, thick as the snow outside. Finally, he said, "Clara, may I come in?" My voice trembled. After all this time?" He nodded, eyes glistening. "I came to tell you the truth. And that's when I realized, whatever I had imagined all those years, the real story was something I was never prepared for." I stood there on the porch, the wind slipping through the open door, carrying the faint scent of snow and pine. 30 Christmases had passed since the morning he left, and there he was, the man who had broken every promise, standing before me like the ending of a story I'd long stopped expecting. Henry didn't look the same. The spark in his eyes was dimmer now, replaced by something heavier. Not guilt exactly, but sorrow. He clutched his hat in his hands, fingers trembling. The air between us was full of all the words we never said. Finally, I stepped aside. "Come in," I whispered. He hesitated, just for a breath, then crossed the threshold like a man stepping into his own memory. And the house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the old clock on the mantel, the one he had fixed 100 times before. He looked around slowly, eyes tracing every corner. "You kept it just the same," he murmured. "I tried," I said. "It's easier to live with the same ghosts than to invite new ones." He winced. "You have every right to hate me." "I did," I said simply, "for a long time. But hate gets tired, Henry. And when it does, it turns into something else, a quieter kind of hurt." He stood near the fireplace, warming his hands. The flames flickered over his face, showing the deep lines etched by time. "I didn't come back to ask for forgiveness," he said softly. "I came because it's time you knew why." "Why you left," I said. He nodded. "Why I couldn't stay." I motioned for him to sit. He sank into the same chair he'd always used, the one that had waited empty for 30 winters. I made tea out of habit, not kindness, and set a cup before him. He stared into it for a long moment, as though afraid of its warmth. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "The morning I left, you remember the letter that came?" I frowned. "Letter? No. You didn't see it," he said. "It came early, before you woke. It was from my brother, Samuel." I blinked. "Samuel? But Henry, your brother died when you were a child." He looked at me then, eyes wet. "No, Clara. That's what I told you. That's the lie I lived with." My hands froze on the teacup. He continued, voice trembling. "Samuel didn't die. He ran away, got mixed up with bad people. For years I didn't know where he was. And that Christmas morning he wrote to me, said he was sick, said he was dying and needed to see me one last time." I felt my breath catch. "So I left," he whispered. "I left thinking I'd be back by noon. I thought I could keep you out of the mess, see him, bring him home, and still make it for breakfast. I even packed that toy train for Matthew. I was going to surprise you both." He rubbed his face with shaking hands. "But when I got there—" He didn't finish. His shoulders trembled. I waited, my chest tightening with dread. "When I got there, Samuel was gone," he said finally. "The house was empty. The neighbors said a man in a dark coat had taken him away the night before. I searched, Clara, for days, for weeks. And when I found him—" He swallowed hard. "It was too late." The words hung in the air like frost. "I couldn't come home," he went on quietly. "Not after that. I thought you'd hate me for lying all those years, for hiding him, for choosing him that morning instead of you." "I wouldn't have," I said softly. "I would have understood." He smiled weakly. "I didn't know that then. I only knew shame. I thought if I disappeared, you could build a new life without the weight of my mistakes." I leaned back in my chair, staring into the fire. 30 years, I said. You let me believe you were dead." "I wanted to write," he said. God, I wanted to. But every time I tried, I heard your voice in my head, the way you said my name that morning, the way Matthew looked at me when I walked out the door. I couldn't bear to shatter what little you might have had left of me. So you stayed gone, I whispered. He nodded. I stayed gone. Until last year. Last year, I got sick, he said quietly. A heart condition. The doctor told me time's running short. I've been living in a small town a few hours away. When the first snow came this year, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to see. Silence filled the room, heavy and slow. I watched him, the man I had loved, the man I had lost. His hands were older, his eyes dimmer, but beneath it all was still the boy I'd fallen in love with by the lake 50 years ago. Does Matthew know? I asked finally. He shook his head. No, I didn't think I deserved to see him, but if you'll let me, I'd like to. I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. He deserves to know his father's alive. Henry looked away, guilt clouding his face. Do you think he'll forgive me? I took a deep breath. Forgiveness isn't something you earn in words, Henry. It's something you live for, if you're lucky enough to get the chance. We sat in silence again. The clock ticked steadily. Finally, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. I brought something for you, he said. Something I should have given you years ago. Inside was a folded letter, the paper yellowed with time. On the front, in his handwriting, were the words, "For Clara, when it's time." My fingers shook as I opened it. My dearest Clara, if you ever read this, it means I finally found the courage to come home. There are things I can't undo, but I can tell you the truth. I never stopped loving you. I left because I thought I could protect you from my past, but I only ended up protecting myself from forgiveness. Every Christmas I pictured you by the tree, the candlelight on your face. I wondered if you still set out my cup. I wondered if Matthew still hung 2 stockings. I wondered if you ever stopped believing I might walk through that door. I'm sorry for every winter I stole from you. If I could give them back, I would. If there's any mercy left in this world, I hope it's in your heart. Love always, Henry. When I looked up, Henry's eyes were glistening. I never sent it, he said. I kept rewriting it every year. But now, I needed you to have it, from my hands, not a stranger's. I folded the letter slowly, pressing it to my chest. You could have come home, I whispered. All these years, and you could have walked through that door. He nodded. I know, but I wasn't the man you deserved back then. And now? He smiled faintly. Now, I just want to be the man who tells you the truth before it's too late. Fire burned low. The shadows stretched long across the room. For the first time in decades, I saw him not as the man who left, but as the man who finally came back. Older, broken, but brave enough to face what he'd run from. I reached for his hand. It was cold, but solid. Real. You're home, Henry, I said softly. That's all that matters now. He let out a breath, half a sigh, half a sob. Home, he repeated. I never thought I'd hear that word again. He froze, disbelief flooding his face. Dad, he whispered. Henry's voice broke. I'm sorry, son. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know I'm still here, and that I've missed you every day since the one I left. Matthew's jaw clenched. 30 years, Dad. 30 Christmases without you. Henry nodded, tears rolling freely. I know, and I don't deserve a single one of them back. But I'm here now, if you'll let me try. Took hours and tears and silence. But by evening, I saw something soften in Matthew's eyes, the same kindness he'd inherited from his father. Before leaving, he turned to me and whispered, He looks smaller now, Mom. Not like a ghost anymore. I smiled sadly. That's what truth does, sweetheart. It shrinks the monsters we built out of silence. That night, after Matthew left, Henry sat beside me by the fire again. I'll leave in the morning, he said quietly. I don't want to disrupt your life. I shook my head. Stay a little while longer. We both waited long enough, don't you think? He smiled, eyes wet. You're still you, Clara. Still the only warmth I ever knew. And that was how the second Christmas began, the first one we shared again after 30 winters apart. We didn't exchange gifts, we didn't sing, we just sat in quiet peace, holding hands, watching the snow fall. And for the first time in decades, I didn't feel the cold. Because sometimes the greatest miracle isn't in what comes wrapped with ribbons and bows, it's in who finds their way back to you when you've stopped believing they ever would. The snow had stopped by morning, leaving the world silver and still. Henry was already awake when I came downstairs. He sat by the window wearing that old brown coat, the same one he'd worn the day he left. It hung looser now, his shoulders smaller beneath it. He held a photograph in his hands, Matthew at 8 years old, standing beside a half-built snowman. "Where did you find that?" I asked softly. He smiled faintly. "I carried it with me, every winter, 30 years of distance between us, and somehow that one picture had survived." We spent the morning quietly, he helping me peel apples, me pretending not to notice when his hands shook. The years had not been kind. His breath came short, his skin paper thin, yet there was a light in him that I hadn't seen since we were young. The kind of light people have when they know time is running out, but still want to leave warmth behind. By afternoon, he grew tired. "Mind if I rest a bit?" he asked. "Go ahead," I said. "Guest room's made up." But he only smiled. "No, I think I'll nap right here. This chair's seen more of our life than any bed." He closed his eyes, the photo still in his lap. I covered him with a blanket, and for the first time in years, felt peace settle in the house like soft dust. When I went to check on him later, the blanket had slipped to the floor. He was breathing evenly, his face calm. I bent to pick up the blanket and noticed something sticking out of the inside pocket of his coat, an envelope corner, worn and yellow. Curiosity whispered louder than manners. I hesitated, then carefully eased it free. On the front, in his uneven handwriting, were just 3 words, "For Matthew, later." I froze. I knew I shouldn't read it. But 30 years of wondering what he'd hidden from us pressed heavy on my chest. And something about those 2 words, "for Matthew," made me feel he wanted it found. So I opened it. The letter was written on lined paper, the ink faded in places. "My son, if you ever read this, it means I didn't get the chance to say these words in person. You were 8 when I left. I've carried that morning like a wound that never closed. The truth is, I didn't walk away from you. I walked towards something I thought would protect us both. That morning, my brother Samuel wrote me from the hospital. He said he'd been diagnosed with something called mesothelioma. Said the men he'd worked for blamed him for talking to the police, and that they'd come for him. He begged me not to tell anyone, especially your mother. I thought I could go, calm things down, bring him home before breakfast. I told myself it would be quick. It wasn't. By the time I found him, he was gone. Not just from sickness, but from fear. And the people who had hurt him warned me. If I spoke, they'd come for you and your mother next. So I disappeared. My hands trembled as I read. For years I moved from town to town, using different names. I sent money when I could. Small envelopes left at the church with no return address. Maybe you remember the mysterious donor who paid for your school shoes one year. That was me, son. I built furniture in little shops, fixed fences, anything that kept me close to wood and far from questions. I kept your photograph in my coat pocket through every winter. If you're holding this letter now, please know, none of it was your fault, and none of it was your mother's. I left to keep you safe, and I stayed away to make sure the danger died with the men who threatened us. But fear has a way of becoming its own prison, and I've lived in it long enough. You have her heart, Matthew. Strong, stubborn, kind. Take care of her for me when I can't, And forgive me if you can, not for leaving, but for staying gone so long, Dad. When I finished reading, the paper fluttered in my shaking hands. The room blurred through tears I hadn't realized were falling. All those Christmases, all that silence, and behind it, fear. He hadn't left for another woman or for himself. He'd left because he was trying in the only broken way he knew to save us. I slipped the letter back into the coat just as Henry stirred awake. He blinked at me sleepily. "You've been crying." I forced a small smile. "Old memories do that." He looked at me closely. "You found it, didn't you?" I nodded. He sighed, long and heavy. "I was going to give it to him tomorrow. Guess it doesn't matter now. You always did find what I tried to hide." "Why didn't you just tell me?" I asked. "We could have faced it together." He reached for my hand, his grip weak but sure. "Because I couldn't stand the thought of you being afraid. You deserved peace, not a lifetime of looking over your shoulder." "You gave me silence instead," I whispered. He nodded sadly. "I know. And I've lived inside that silence every day." The clock struck 5, its chime echoing softly. Outside, the sky glowed pink against the snow. He leaned back, eyes distant. "Do you ever wonder how many moments we waste thinking we're protecting the ones we love when all they wanted was the truth?" I swallowed hard. "Every day." Later that evening, Matthew came by again. Henry handed him the envelope himself this time. Matthew's hands trembled as he unfolded it, reading quietly by the firelight. When he finished, he didn't speak. He just stood there, shoulders shaking, and then he reached for his father. It wasn't a grand embrace, just the awkward, trembling kind shared between two men who've both aged too much for anger. But in that single gesture, something shifted. The years didn't vanish, but they loosened their hold. After Matthew left that night, Henry seemed lighter, almost boyish. He talked for hours about the towns he'd lived in, the strangers who'd shown him kindness, the winters he'd nearly frozen through. Every story carried a mix of regret and gratitude, the way life always does when you've finally stopped running. When I rose to make more tea, he caught my hand. "Clara," he said softly, "thank you for letting me come home." I smiled through tears. "Home was always here, Henry. You were the one who forgot the address." That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt too full of ghosts that were finally finding rest. I got up, wrapped myself in a shawl, and went to check on him. He was asleep again in the chair, head tilted, the faintest smile on his lips. In his lap lay the photograph of the three of us, Matthew, Henry, and me, taken the year before he disappeared. The firelight flickered across it, and I thought, maybe peace looks like this. Morning came gray and quiet. I brewed coffee and called his name, but he didn't answer. When I touched his shoulder, his hand slipped from the armrest, still warm, but still. For a long while, I stood there, my hand on his, listening to the clock tick. It wasn't shock that filled me. It was something gentler, like the closing of a door that had stayed open too long. He'd made it home for one last Christmas. And he'd left the truth behind, folded neatly in a coat pocket. The funeral was small. Just me, Matthew, a few kind neighbors. Snow fell lightly through the service, soft as forgiveness. When it ended, Matthew placed the letter back in his father's coat before they closed the casket. "He carried it all these years," he said quietly. "Seems right he should keep it now." I nodded, tears blurring the world. "He carried us too?" "In his own way." That evening, I sat by the window, the house quiet once more. The coat still hung on the back of the chair where he'd left it, faintly smelling of cedar and winter. I ran my hand along the worn fabric and whispered, "You made it home, Henry. You kept your promise after all." The snow outside glittered under the streetlight. For the first time in decades, Christmas didn't hurt. It just felt full of endings, of beginnings, of peace, finally earned. The morning after the funeral, the house felt too quiet. There is a stillness that follows loss, a hush so deep that even the ticking of a clock feels intrusive. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of untouched tea, staring at the chair where Henry had spent his final hours. The blanket still draped over the backrest, the faint shape of his shoulders pressed into the cushion. It felt as if he might walk in at any moment, ask for sugar, and hum under his breath the way he always did. But the only sound was the slow creak of the floorboards as the house learned to breathe again without him. Matthew arrived before noon. He looked older than he had just days earlier. Grief has a way of aging a person overnight. He placed a box on the table, small and wooden, polished to a soft shine. "I found this in Dad's workshop," he said quietly. "It had your name carved underneath." My name, Clara, etched in Henry's careful handwriting, faint from time. I traced it with my finger, the grooves cool and familiar. "Open it," Matthew said. "I think he wanted you to have whatever's inside." I lifted the lid slowly. Inside, wrapped in old newspaper, were three objects: a small brass key, a folded envelope, and a tiny carved bird made of oak. The bird's wings were outstretched, as if caught mid-flight. Henry had always carved birds when he was restless. The envelope had only one line written on it: "For when you're ready." My hands shook as I unfolded it. "My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, it means I finally kept my promise. I came home. I hope somehow I made things right before the end. But there is one last thing I need you to do for me. 30 years ago, when I disappeared, I stored away something that was meant for you and Matthew. It isn't money or anything grand. It's something simpler, a piece of our life I couldn't bear to let go of. The key belongs to a small storage shed behind the old church in Brookdale, the one where we first met. I rented it under another name years ago. Inside, you'll find what I built in the quiet years. It's yours now. Don't go alone. Take Matthew. I want you both to see it together. With all my love, Henry." Brookdale was an hour's drive away, a tiny town surrounded by pines and the whisper of old winters. The road curved along frozen fields, the snow shining like crushed glass beneath the pale sun. Neither Matthew nor I spoke much. The car filled with the kind of silence that carries both ache and anticipation. When we reached the church, the world seemed held in stillness. Its bell tower leaned slightly with age, the doors shut tight against the cold. Behind it, half hidden by bare trees, stood a small wooden shed, just as Henry had written. The lock was rusted, but the key turned easily, as if waiting all these years for this moment. Inside smelled of cedar, dust, and time. For a heartbeat, we stood there in silence, letting our eyes adjust. Then Matthew gasped softly. Along every wall were shelves lined with tiny wooden boxes, dozens of them, stacked neatly, each labeled with a year. 1988, 1989, 1990, all the way to the present. I lifted one down. Inside lay a small carving, a snow-covered house, a tiny figure at the door, a child holding a lantern. Underneath, a folded note: Christmas 1989. Matthew's first school play. I couldn't be there, but I heard he sang louder than anyone. Carved this to remember the sound I never got to hear. My throat tightened. I reached for another box. Each one held a carving and a note, a memory Henry had built out of wood when he couldn't live it in person. Christmas 1994. Clara started teaching piano again. I imagined the house filled with music. I built a tiny piano so I could almost hear it. Christmas 2002. Matthew graduated. I wasn't there, but I carved him standing tall. I hope he knows I'm proud. We opened box after box, each one a quiet confession, each one a piece of the years we thought we'd lost. By the time we reached the last shelf, tears blurred my vision. Matthew sat cross-legged on the floor, holding one of the carvings, a small bird, wings open. "Mom," he said softly, "he never stopped being here." I nodded. No, he just found another way to stay. At the back of the shed was one larger chest, heavier, carved with delicate vines. The lid creaked when we lifted it. Inside lay a blanket, hand-stitched, made from patches of old shirts, handkerchiefs, bits of fabric I recognized from decades ago. There was a note pinned to it, for when the winters feel too long. Every square is a year I missed, sewn together so you'll never be cold again. I pressed the fabric to my face, the scent of cedar and faint tobacco still clinging to it. Matthew rested a hand on my shoulder, and for the first time since his father's return, I saw peace in his eyes. He gave us back every Christmas, he whispered. We spent hours there, reading, remembering, crying, laughing through tears. When the sun began to sink, the shed glowed with golden light, like a place touched by grace. Before we left, I gathered the smallest box, the very first one, labeled 1988. On the lid, Henry had carved a single word, home. I held it against my chest. He never forgot where home was, I said. Matthew smiled. He just needed time to find the road back. That night, back in our own kitchen, we placed the blanket over the couch and lined the carvings along the mantel. The room looked different, warmer, somehow alive again. Each tiny piece of wood whispered the same truth. Love doesn't vanish even when people do. It waits quietly, shaping itself into whatever form it can. As I brewed tea, Matthew sat by the fire. "Do you think he knew he was dying when he wrote that letter?" he asked. "I think he knew," I said, "and I think this was his way of saying goodbye without leaving us empty-handed." Later, after Matthew went home, I stayed awake, tracing the pattern on the blanket. Each patch was uneven, each stitch imperfect, yet together they made something whole. I realized that's what forgiveness looks like. Not erasing what's broken, but weaving it into something that still keeps you warm. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and endless. I whispered into the quiet, "Thank you, Henry, for the last gift." And in that moment, I could almost hear him answer, just the faintest echo in the wind. "You were always my home, Clara." That winter lingered longer than most, the kind that wraps the world in silence, not cruelly, but softly, as if asking us to rest a while before the next chapter begins. Every morning, I lit the fire and watched the smoke curl up toward the cold sky. The house felt different now, not empty, but gentled. The weight of years had shifted into something lighter, almost like gratitude. Henry's coat still hung on the peg by the door. The boxes from the shed were stacked neatly on the shelf, and the blanket he'd stitched sat folded at the foot of my bed, its faded colors glowing faintly in the morning light. 30 years he'd been gone. One Christmas he returned, and somehow that single week was enough to make peace with a lifetime. A few days after we'd found the shed, Matthew called. "Mom," he said, "you should see what they wrote in the local paper." He sent a clipping, a small story buried near the back pages. It read, "Local carpenter's legacy found, town honors man who quietly helped families for decades." My breath caught. The article said that over the years, Henry had anonymously donated handcrafted furniture to widows, orphanages, and small-town churches all over the region, leaving no name, only a carved symbol of a bird in flight, the same bird that sat now on my mantel. "Seems Dad never stopped building homes," Matthew said softly. "He just did it for others." I smiled through tears. That's who he was. Even when he broke, he built. That night, Matthew came over with his family, my grandchildren bouncing through the hallway with laughter that filled every corner of the house. Little Emma, the youngest, tugged on my sleeve. "Grandma," she asked, "is that the bird Grandpa made?" "Yes, darling," I said, placing it in her small hands. "He carved it to remind us that love always finds its way home." She turned it over, eyes wide. "Can I put it on the tree?" "Of course you can," I said, my heart full. She hung it carefully on the highest branch she could reach, right beside the star. and when the firelight touched the little wooden bird, its wings glowed as if alive again. After dinner, we gathered around the fire. Matthew picked up one of his father's carvings, a miniature of the old house, and turned it over in his hands. "Mom," he said, "I think we should tell his story. Maybe at the church next Christmas, about what he built, what he left behind." I nodded slowly. Yes, people should know that love can look like silence too. Not perfect, not easy, but real. He smiled. "You still miss him?" I looked into the flames. "Every day, but not with pain anymore. More like remembering a song I once knew by heart." When they all left later that evening, I stayed by the tree, the only light coming from the flickering fire and the tiny wooden bird above it. The quiet didn't hurt this time. It wrapped around me like the blanket Henry had sewn. I reached for one of the boxes from the shed, the last one, labeled simply 2023. Inside was another carving, a small candle carved from maple, its flame delicately shaped. Beneath it, a note in Henry's hand. "When you see this, it means I've come home for good. Don't let the house stay dark too long, Clara. Keep the light burning. That's how I'll find you again." My breath caught. He must have carved it before he ever came back, as if he knew this would be the last piece of the puzzle. I placed the little candle carving on the windowsill and lit a real one beside it. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and steady. For a moment, I could almost see him, standing under the lamplight at the end of the path, his breath rising in the cold, his hand lifted in a quiet wave. The days that followed were gentle. I began teaching piano again, mostly children, their laughter spilling through the rooms like spring water. Matthew visited often, bringing coffee and stories about work. And every evening before closing the curtains, I lit the candle on the windowsill. Some nights, I'd whisper to it, as if to the man who had loved imperfectly but wholly, "I see you, Henry. You're still here." The next Christmas came with clear skies. The grandchildren helped me decorate early, stringing garlands and laughter across the old walls. When we finished, I stood back and looked at the tree. Near the top, the wooden bird still hung, wings spread. Beneath it, the candle carving caught the light, two small reminders of one great truth: love endures. I smiled and whispered, "Merry Christmas, Henry." And though the room was empty, I could swear the air shimmered, as if the years themselves had bowed their heads in peace. That night, as snow blanketed the world outside, I sat by the fire and began to write. Not letters I'd never send, but stories meant to be shared. Stories of waiting, of loss, of forgiveness and grace. Because if I'd learned anything, it was this: the things that break us can also teach us how to love more deeply, more quietly. And maybe, just maybe, someone out there needed to hear it. So I wrote until the candle burned low, the wooden bird casting a faint shadow on the wall. And in that moment, surrounded by memory and warmth, I felt a soft certainty settle in my chest, like a heartbeat from beyond time. Henry had left many years ago, but love, once sown, doesn't die. It becomes the light that guides us home. That was Grandma Clara's story of love that outlived silence and light that never truly went out. If this story touched your heart, my dear, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Grandma's Story Lounge, where every tale reminds us that it's never too late. Thank you for watching. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and press the bell icon. I share new emotional stories and life lessons every day.